Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we embark on a long drifting journey through shadowed halls and starlit deserts, into a time when Persia stood at its most dazzling height before it slid, almost imperceptibly, into twilight. You will see the empire in its glory, walls shimmering with polished stone, armies stretching farther than the horizon, wealth so vast that even the peacocks strutted like aristocrats. And then, you will feel the quiet shifting of sand beneath the marble. Because no matter how mighty, every empire eventually stumbles. A cheeky reality check here: you probably wouldn't survive even one day in this palace, unless you had the charm of a courtier, the endurance of a satrap, and the luck of a gambler in a loaded dice game. But lucky you, you're tucked in bed, safe and warm, letting me do the wandering. Before we unfurl the great scroll of tonight's tale, I'll gently nudge you to like this video. It keeps me fed with motivation, perhaps more safely than a Persian noble receiving figs laced with unexpected seasonings. Subscribe if you want more journeys through corridors where ambition outweighs caution, and comment where you're listening from. Tell me the hour too. Maybe someone nearby, half a world away, is lying in their own bed, sinking into these same whispers of history. There's a comfort in knowing the empire of insomnia is the one realm we all share. Now close your eyes and step with me into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid dynasty. You feel the sun setting across the Zagros Mountains, a sweep of gold over carved staircases that stretch with endless rows of tribute bearers frozen in stone. Lions grip bulls in eternal combat on the palace walls. Columns reach skyward, capped by double-headed animals that look as if they might leap down and join the banquet. At its zenith, the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the steppes of Central Asia down into the lush valleys of Egypt. Imagine it, 28 satrapies feeding their wealth and people into the arteries of one crown. Darius the Great's administrative system, refined with roads, messengers, and royal inspectors, created what some historians still call the first truly global empire. Taxes flowed, languages blended, and more than one unlucky goat was carried hundreds of miles just to be sacrificed at the right festival. Yet here in the dusk, the gleam carries a shadow. For all the grandeur, you sense the strain beneath the marble. Scholars debate whether this wealth was sustainable or hollow, whether the great ceremonies masked an empire stretched too thin. Was Persia at its height a colossus of order or an overstuffed couch about to collapse under its own cushions? You trudge into the great audience hall, the Apadana, and hear the echoes of voices long gone. Envoys once shuffled nervously here, bearing gifts and grievances. A Babylonian with a jar of honey, an Ethiopian with a tusk, an Ionian with jars of olive oil, each one rehearsing their bows, hoping not to sneeze at the wrong moment. Did it matter? Perhaps less than they believed, for power rested not in these offerings, but in the delicate balance of loyalty at the top. One fringe tale tells us that visitors, or sometimes dazzled so thoroughly by the spectacle of gold, silver, and perfumed fires that they lost their way back to their own quarters. It might be apocryphal, but it's a pleasant image. Diplomats wandering like confused tourists, trying not to spill their tribute baskets while mumbling, which hallway had the lion mosaic. A joke, yes, but it hints at the empire's true weapon: overwhelming grandeur as a form of soft power. But empires do not live on pomp alone. Beneath the polished facade, the palace was already heavy with whispers. The courtiers, scribes, and generals who bowed so low in public were already calculating in private. For a king who ruled so much land, every choice reverberated, every cousin favored, every satrap punished, every feast invitation sent or withheld. The cracks in an empire rarely begin with loud crashes. They start as murmurs you can almost but not quite ignore. Historians wrestle with this opening question. Did Persia fall because of external might, Alexander's lightning campaigns, or because of internal decay? Was the twilight inevitable, even without a Macedonian rising in the west? Some argue the system was too vast, too dependent on the delicate balance of loyalty and fear. Others point to vibrant adaptability, reminding us that Persia had survived revolts, invasions, and even the occasional royal assassination. If you ask me, lying here with the story spilling slow and steady, the truth is somewhere in the blend, a palace of marble that stood proudly, but within which the echoes of footsteps already carried the hollow tone of fragility. The last glow fades on the palace roofs, oil lamps flicker to life, shadows stretch across carved walls, and the night air grows cool. You pause on the threshold, gazing back once more at the empire's shining breadth. From here, it looks eternal, and yet, as you step inside, the faintest draft whispers otherwise. You walk deeper into the dim halls of Persepolis, the torchlight trembling along carved reliefs of kings seated proudly on their thrones. The faces of Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes seem to watch you, eyes unblinking, as though waiting to judge whether you are loyal enough to remain within these walls. And yet, you feel a heaviness hanging in the air, not only from the smoke of braziers, but from the unease that lingers in the later days of the Achaemenid Empire. The empire is enormous, glorious still, but the tension hums like the faint buzz of flies around honey. The cracks are not yet open fissures, but you sense them. Nobles eye each other over their cups of wine, their smiles stretched to thin. Satraps, the governors of far-flung provinces, grow powerful, sometimes wealthier than the king himself. In theory, they serve the throne. In practice, they hoard, scheme, and occasionally whisper into foreign ears. Some historians argue the satrapal system was ingenious, allowing Persia to administer diverse peoples efficiently. Others counter that it was also the empire's Achilles' heel, empowering ambitious men who could one day turn their troops and treasuries against the center. It is the timeless dilemma of delegation. Do you trust your subordinates, or watch them until you grow paranoid? In Persia, both were done and both carried risks. The Persian king, called King of Kings, was meant to embody unity. Yet in the later Achaemenid period, especially after Xerxes I, kings struggled to maintain the same charisma and iron grip as their predecessors. You imagine Xerxes gazing across his empire, hands heavy with rings, confident in his authority. And then, generations later, you picture Artaxerxes too less commanding, tugged this way and that by courtiers, concubines, generals, and the incessant hum of conspiracy. One fringe tidbit, often whispered by chroniclers: palace corridors rang not only with official proclamations, but with endless rumors about which noble favored which dancer, whose banquet was more extravagant, or which general's armor glistened suspiciously new. Think of it as ancient tabloid gossip, less glossy paper, more clay tablets, but just as distracting. Imagine being a scribe tasked with recording tribute, only to overhear eunuch muttering that Lady so-and-so had bewitched the satrap of Lydia. Was it true? Perhaps not, but in an environment where whispers could topple dynasties, every rumor carried weight. The mood of unease grows clearer as you recall the rebellion simmering in Egypt, the constant unrest in Asia Minor, the ever-present Greek mercenaries for hire men who would fight for gold, not loyalty. Even within the palace walls, assassinations were not unheard of. One king might rise with the support of courtiers, only to fall to poison dripped into his wine. Another might secure his throne by eliminating brothers, only to be haunted by the same fate later. You, walking these echoing halls, sense that no ruler here truly sleeps soundly. Scholars debate whether the empire at this point was still robust or already unraveling. Some argue the immense wealth flowing through Persepolis proved stability, the roads functioned, taxes arrived, festivals dazzled. Others argue that the wealth itself was a mask, gold piled high as the throne weakened beneath it. The pomp remained, but the core of unity softened. Think of it like a grand banquet table. The dishes are exquisite, the goblets heavy with wine, but the legs of the table wobble slightly. Most guests ignore it, enjoying their figs and lamb, until suddenly the whole feast collapses in a clatter. You pause in a shadowed corridor. Musicians rehearse for the evening. Their zithers twang lightly. Their songs are meant to soothe, yet you catch in their rhythm a strange tension, like a melody that refuses to resolve. A eunuch glides by silently, adjusting a lamp. His eyes meet yours briefly, then flick away, as if to say, "Careful where you walk, stranger. Even stone walls here carry secrets." Outside, the night settles on the empire's vast expanse. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the plains of India, men and women live under the Persian crown. Farmers till fields, soldiers patrol roads, traders haggle in bazaars. To them, the empire might feel stable, even eternal. But here, in the heart of the palace, you see the other truth. The empire is fragile, trembling on the edge of storm. The stage is set, the actors are restless. And you, drifting between torchlight and shadow, know the curtain is about to rise on betrayal. You move further down the corridors, past frescoes of kings triumphant, but behind those painted victories lies a quieter story of succession, struggles, and betrayals that appeared almost invisible at first, but which would later fracture the empire. The first cracks are never thunderclaps, they are hairline fissures creeping along the marble, the kind you barely notice until the column suddenly splits. Tonight, you listen to those faint lines spreading. The Achaemenid throne, for all its splendor, was never free of family rivalry. Darius the Great once established a system of succession meant to smooth transitions. Eldest sons would inherit, or at least the most competent among the royal line. In practice, however, Every coronation was like handing a bowl of figs to a room full of hungry monkeys. Brothers eyed each other, cousins counted their supporters, and generals pledged loyalty with one hand while polishing daggers with the other. One of the earliest cracks after the zenith came with the succession following Xerxes. First, his assassination in 465 BC set the stage for a brutal contest. The story goes that Xerxes was killed by his own courtier, Artabanus, a man entrusted with great power. Was it loyalty gone sour, or simply ambition too great to contain? Accounts differ. Some historians suggest Artabanus acted out of fear for his own life, believing the king planned to execute him. Others think he was simply lured by the opportunity to control the empire. Whatever the motive, the king was dead, and the empire trembled. For a brief moment, Artabanus ruled as regent, even placing Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' son, on the throne. But irony of ironies, within months, the very man who had orchestrated the assassination was himself killed. The new king turned on him, eliminating both Artabanus and his family. A fringe story whispers that Artabanus had consulted the court magi Persian priests before striking. They had warned him that killing a king would invite chaos. He dismissed them. If true, you might imagine him regretting that decision in the last flicker of torchlight before his execution. As you wander past shadowed chambers, you think of how fragile power must have felt. One night you dine with the king, sharing pomegranates. The next night you are accused of betrayal, your family's name erased from tablets. The empire looks strong to outsiders, but internally, each succession exposed the fault lines of ambition. Some scholars debate whether these cracks were inevitable in a hereditary monarchy. Was it better to have a clear line of succession, even if weak princes inherited? Or was it better to allow competition, hoping the strongest would rise? Persia tried both, and both sowed turmoil. The Greeks, watching from across the sea, mocked this instability, claiming Persian kings fell more often to daggers in their palaces than to foreign enemies. A smug observation, though not entirely false. Quirky tidbit here, according to one ancient anecdote, when a new king ascended, courtiers would rush to proclaim their loyalty by showering him with absurdly extravagant gifts, embroidered carpets, golden goblets, even exotic animals. One unfortunate noble once presented a prized hunting dog, only for the animal to nip at the royal sandals in front of the entire court. The poor man's loyalty speech was cut short, and so, most likely, was his career. You imagine the eunuchs whispering afterward, "Perhaps next time bring figs instead." But beneath the humor lies the truth. These small betrayals and awkward power plays were the early cracks. A satrap hesitates to send troops because he waits to see which prince survives the struggle. A general delays allegiance until the dust clears. Each hesitation weakens the empire a fraction, like threads unraveling from a magnificent tapestry. As you pause in a darkened antechamber, you hear faint music drifting in flutes and drums from the banquet halls. The notes are light, but the rhythm feels off, uneven. It mirrors the empire itself, outwardly beautiful, but with a faltering beat inside. The first cracks have appeared, subtle yet undeniable. And though the walls still stand, you know they will widen, until no amount of gold or carved stone can hold them together. You step from the antechamber into a vast courtyard where moonlight spills across polished flagstones. The silence is deceptive, for in these spaces the empire's true game unfolds not in open battlefields, but in whispered bargains, sharpened glances, and dinners where every toast might conceal a blade. Here the players gather, each one convinced that destiny favors them, though history reminds us that destiny is rarely so loyal. At the center stands the king, cloaked in authority and ritual. By the later Achaemenid period, the monarch bore titles so lofty they might have embarrassed even the sun. King of kings, great king, king of lands and peoples. To his subjects he was the axis on which the empire turned. Yet beneath the diadem sat a mortal man, subject to the same fears and weaknesses as any courtier. Artaxerxes II, for example, ruled for more than 4 decades, the longest of any Persian monarch, but his reign was punctuated by endless rebellions from brothers, satraps, and Greek mercenaries. The irony: the longer he clung to power, the more fragile the empire became, like a candle burning high yet dripping wax that threatened to extinguish its own flame. Beside the king lurked the satraps, the governors of Persia's sprawling provinces. Officially, they were administrators, tasked with collecting tribute, maintaining order, and raising troops. In reality, many grew into semi-independent princes, their coffers heavy, their loyalty conditional. A satrap in Lydia, I'd dream of expanding his dominion with mercenaries from Athens. Another in Bactria, I'd prefer to strike deals with nomadic tribes. Scholars often debate whether the satrapal system was Persia's greatest strength or its fatal flaw. One camp praises the efficiency of regional control. The other points to the inevitable temptation for satraps to crown themselves kings in miniature. You can almost hear them boasting at banquets, "Yes, yes, the king of kings rules Persia, but here in my province, the figs are sweeter and the soldiers march to my drum." Hovering in the palace shadows, you glimpse the courtiers, chamberlains, scribes, and advisors who spun webs of influence tighter than any spider. Some wielded wit sharper than swords, others thrived by flattery, whispering just enough to sway a royal decree. One fringe anecdote suggests that a scribe once altered a single word in a tax record, changing tribute to gift, thereby elevating a satrap standing with the king. A tiny flourish of ink, but enough to tilt alliances. Imagine the bureaucratic equivalent of slipping an extra zero on a check, not a noble act, but effective if unnoticed. And then there were the generals, men who commanded the empire's armies yet whose loyalties often bent like reeds in the wind. Take Cyrus the Younger, who rallied Greek mercenaries to challenge his own brother, Artaxerxes II. He promised them gold, glory, and perhaps better dinners than their homeland provided. The resulting clash at Cunaxa in 401 BC was not only a battle of brothers, but a preview of how Persian authority could unravel from within. The king survived, but the message was clear. Generals with ambition could shake the throne itself. Amid this cast, you cannot forget the often overlooked players, eunuchs who guarded secrets, queens who nudged kings toward decisions, and concubines who, with a word, could shift allegiances. Each figure walked these marble halls with calculated steps, aware that one misjudged alliance could end in silence and oblivion. You pause in the courtyard, the night air brushing cool across your face. The moonlight casts long shadows, and for a moment, the figures of these players seem matched in the air. A king burdened by diadem and doubt, a satrap counting coins, a general sharpening ambition, a scribe dipping his pen with slight precision. The stage is crowded, the actors restless. The play, however, has only just begun, and you, silent observer, sense that every move from here will matter, every whispered word, every glance, every sip of wine. The players are set, their motives sharp. What follows will be nothing less than the slow unraveling of an empire. You step back into the corridors, where the torchlight flickers against carved lions, and the air seems to hum with tension. It is not the grand declarations that shake empires first, but the quiet murmurs that slide along the marble. The whispers begin here, faint at first like the rustle of silk curtains in a draught, but soon they grow into currents strong enough to topple kings. In the late Achaemenid court, assassination was less an exception than a recurring option. You can almost hear the low tones exchanged between courtiers as they shuffle past, voices smooth, words innocuous, but meanings sharp. The king is tired, one says, the satrap grows ambitious, another adds, each statement innocent enough, yet each carrying the seed of conspiracy. Scholars describe Persian palace life as a marketplace of whispers, where alliances were brokered not in official councils, but in shadowed alcoves beside the fire. One of the earliest famous plots came against Xerxes himself. After returning from his failed campaigns in Greece, his bridges burned. His pride wounded, he grew increasingly distant, leaving much of the palace management to trusted advisors. Among them was Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard, who whispered first in loyalty, then in treachery. By some accounts, he stabbed the king in his bedchamber, the torches sputtering as Persia's most powerful man fell in silence. Others argue Xerxes was smothered, or poisoned, or even that Artabanus acted as a pawn for others lurking in the wings. The debates swirl, but one truth remains: the king was dead, and the empire quivered. In your walk, you pass a doorway where eunuchs gather, speaking in hushed voices. These men, stripped of airs and worldly ambition, became perfect vessels for secrets. Ironically, their supposed neutrality made them dangerous. Without family ties, they often served as conduits for plots. Some historians argue they acted as stabilizers, ensuring messages flowed without bias. Others suggest they thrived on fueling chaos, feeding one faction's suspicions to another. Imagine a eunuch leaning toward a satrap with a whisper, "My lord, I overheard the queen speaking warmly of your rival. True or false, the damage was done." Among the court women too, whispers spread like wildfire. Queens and consorts, often underestimated by foreign chroniclers, wielded influence through suggestion. A glance here, a word there, enough to nudge decisions toward or away from disaster. A fringe tale recalls one queen mother who allegedly placed a rival concubine's bracelet in the king's bed, sparking suspicion of disloyalty. Whether the story is true hardly matters. What matters is that even jewelry could become a weapon in this theater of whispers. The conspiracies multiply. Brothers plotted against brothers, satraps against kings, generals against one another. Each failed attempt left scars, executions, exiles, and memories that embolden the next round of schemers. You imagine a banquet where the laughter sounds slightly too forced, where every noble lies his wine goblet before drinking. The torches flare, the musicians play, but beneath it all, each heart beats with suspicion. Scholars often ask, was this constant plotting a sign of weakness, or simply the cost of ruling such an enormous empire? Perhaps both. For in an empire spanning 3 continents, no decree could hold forever, no loyalty could last without being tested. The whispers, in their way, were the empire's pulse, steady, constant, sometimes racing toward fever. You pause at a carved relief, the stone figures eternally calm, bearing gifts for their king. Yet in your ears, you hear only murmurs, who will rise, who will fall, and which whisper will become the dagger that ends a reign. You move beyond the banquet chambers into the innermost courtyards, where silence wraps itself around the polished stones like a second cloak. Here, you find the king, not the radiant image carved in stone, not the towering figure painted on palace walls, but the man himself, retreating deeper into solitude as whispers multiply around him. Kingship, for all its glory, is a lonely burden. And in these late Achaemenid halls, isolation becomes the monarch's undoing. You picture Artaxerxes II, ruling longer than any Persian king before him. 46 years seated on the throne, yet with every passing year, the throne grows heavier. At first he commanded armies and courtiers with confidence. But as conspiracies mounted, his own brother Cyrus plotting rebellion, satraps rebelling in Anatolia, Greeks ever meddling, he withdrew. He became cautious, even timid, preferring the security of rituals and the comfort of loyal attendance to the stormy sea of politics. Scholars disagree. Was this caution wise, preserving stability in the face of chaos, or was it weakness, surrendering initiative to ambitious rivals? Some praise his endurance, others condemn his inertia. Either way, the king's distance widened the gap between throne and court. In these inner rooms, you notice how even luxury breeds estrangement. Gold plates glisten untouched. Musicians play their zithers softly, but the king no longer listens. Courtiers bow, yet their eyes flicker past him toward other centers of power, satraps, queens, eunuchs. The monarch, once the heart of the empire, becomes more symbol than strategist. The courtiers speak in circles, careful not to pierce the bubble of his isolation. It is as if the empire itself tiptoes around its own ruler. A curious tidbit floats from ancient sources. Artaxerxes, it is said, had such a prodigious number of concubines that even he could not remember all their names. Some claimed he fathered over 100 children, a number more befitting myth than fact. Perhaps this was exaggeration, a Greek chronicler's jab at Persian indulgence, but the story illustrates a truth. When surrounded by countless attendants, wives, and children, even the king could feel strangely alone. Too many voices, yet none he could truly trust. Imagine him wandering his palace gardens at night, lanterns swaying, water trickling from carved fountains. He watches the reflections shimmer, but hears only the faint echo of sandals on stone. Every face in his court is a potential conspirator, every feast is a test. Even his food must be tasted by servants first, for poison could be poured as easily as wine. No wonder the king withdraws, preferring to speak with a handful of trusted advisors, or sometimes no one at all. The scholarly debate sharpens here. Was the king isolated because he feared betrayal, or because the structure of empire itself had outgrown the capacity of any one man? Some argue the Achaemenid system demanded constant personal involvement, and once a ruler detached, the machinery faltered. Others believe the system was resilient, designed to survive even when the king vanished into ceremony. But whichever is true, the perception of isolation was enough to embolden rivals. When the king seemed absent, others stepped forward to rule in his shadow. You feel the weight of that absence as you walk through his private quarters. The chambers smell faintly of incense and cedar, but they are too quiet, too vast. You half expect his voice to boom from the throne, but instead, silence reigns. In the stillness, the empire begins to slip, not with a thunderous fall, but with a quiet drift, as though the king himself has stepped away while the courtiers argue over the pieces. And as you leave those lonely chambers, you realize that this isolation is not just personal. It is the empire's own reflection, outwardly grand, inwardly fragile, disconnected from the pulse of its people. The King of Kings sits alone, and the empire trembles around him. You step back into the long audience hall, hearing the soft knock of your sandals measure the distance between trust and treachery. The lamps burn lower, the shadows grow braver. Now the quiet hints turn into names, dates, and knives you can almost feel balanced on your palm. You listen, because in these halls the story of Persia is told through its betrayals, each one a hinge that swings the empire toward a new and shakier balance. You begin where the marble still remembers a gasp. Xerxes I, dead behind curtains, the night air clipped by the blade of Artabanus, commander of the royal guard. Servants freeze, courtiers count their loyalties like coins, and the palace exhales a single, skittering thought: who now? Some sources say the king was stabbed, others claim smothering or poison. A few insist Artabanus acted as a front for deeper hands. The details, like torchlight, flicker, but the consequence does not. A ruler falls, and by morning the hierarchy has been rewritten in the speed of hurried whispers. Scholars argue over culpability and method, weighing Greek chroniclers against palace rumor, but for you, pacing the stones, the fact is enough. Assassination has entered the royal toolkit and will not be returned. The echo of that first rupture sends you forward to Cyrus the Younger, the brother who believes the diadem ought to fit his own brow. In Sardis, he gathers Greek mercenaries, men who march for reliable pay and decent bread, more than for causes, and promises them both. Across the empire, Artaxerxes II occupies the throne with ritual and rank. Yet you know how the story bends. The armies meet at Cunaxa in 401 BCE, and Cyrus dies in the crush. The Greeks, leaderless but stubborn, fight their way north in the March of the 10,000, a mainstream fact that becomes a travel diary of Persian vulnerability. The joke that slips in here is a tired mercenary muttering that he signed up for a campaign, not a cross-continental walking club. The debate that follows you down the corridor, strategic. Did Cyrus's revolt fatally legitimize private armies within the empire, or did it simply reveal an instability already present? Either way, you feel the floorboards loosen beneath the throne. You turn down a side passage that smells of saffron and ink and find the satrap's revolt, a constellation of provincial mutinies in the 360s BC. Governors in Anatolia and beyond test the tensile strength of imperial patience. One shifts allegiance like a dancer changing partners mid-song. Another writes deferential letters while quietly minting his own coin. The revolt never gels into a single bonfire, but its embers glow for years, smoking the draperies. Here the scholarly debate winks at you. Is Satrap's revolt a coherent event, or a label historians later pinned on to overlapping local crises? You walk between shelves of tablets and decide labels matter less than the effect each half-rebellion trains the next. Each negotiated pardon teaches the provinces how far the center will bend. Past a screen of carved cedar, you enter the women's quarters, not rumor's glittering fantasy, but a tactical suite where silk covers iron. Parisodis, mother of Artaxerxes II, moves like a tide that seems gentle until you notice the shoreline has changed. Her devotion to Cyrus is legend, her patience with enemies, famously short. The most retold story glides onto the table with two roasted birds. One is laced with poison, the other not. She offers a half to her rivals to tear and keeps the safe half for herself, so goes the tale. Quirky, yes. Conclusive, no. Scholars quarrel over the reliability of Ctesias, that gossipy Greek at court, and over whether the split bird is moral theater rather than fact. But the scene captures a truth you feel under your skin. In these rooms, cuisine can be a constitutional instrument, and dinner arrives with a disclaimer. If you remember our earlier line about figs with unexpected seasonings, this is the deluxe tasting menu. You breathe in oil and smoke and move toward Bagoas, the eunuch whose name appears whenever a dynasty needs new curtains. Under Artaxerxes III, the palace hums with his influence. Several accounts claim he poisoned the king and then raised the Boarses as a pliable successor, only to remove him when pliability proved inconvenient. Enter Darius III, the last of the line, who at first keeps Bagoas close and then, sensing silk wrapped around a knife, commands him to drink his own medicine. Bagoas, if we trust the story, does so, an ending that doubles as a warning label. Contents may eliminate the container. Historians argue over exaggeration here. Was Bagoas the maestro of succession, or merely the visible tip of wider court consensus? Your step slows. Either way, the pattern holds: the throne is increasingly decided in private rooms, not public fields. You reach a colonnade that opens to moonlight, and the chessboard shows fewer sturdy pieces. News skitters along the tiles, Cappadocia restless, Phoenician cities testing the leash. Egypt slipping in and out of control like a bar of soap in a bath, betrayals at the top rippled downward. Commanders in the field learn that the surest paymaster is not always the official one. Clerks discover that the most dangerous line on a tablet is the one that asks for everything. Immediately, you remember the earlier joke about diplomats losing themselves in Persepolis's grandeur and realize the punchline has soured. Now even generals lose themselves, not in beauty, but in the maze of incentives, waiting to see which letter carries the real seal. A guard nods you into a record chamber where tablets rest like sleeping bricks. You trail a finger across an entry that memorializes a grant confirmed, a penalty remitted, a shipment double-checked. Bureaucracy, the dull hero of empires, now shows bruises. A scribe scratches in a margin, and you sense the difference between ink that reports and ink that edits. The quirky tidbit clerks whisper to one another is almost sweet. Somewhere in these shelves lies a tablet listing the official number of lemons served at a royal lunch, counted with the solemnity of a treaty. You almost laugh, gently, then you notice how the ledgers grow messy exactly, and the politics do. The scholarly quarrel here is technical, a telling. Do changes in the Persepolis fortification and treasury records reflect administrative resilience under stress, or the paper trail of creeping improvisation? Your palm rests on warm clay, and you think, when the numbers wobble, the spears soon follow. You turn again and step toward the timeline's narrowing funnel. Darius III appears Codomanus before the crown found him not a monster, not a miracle, but an administrator promoted into a storm. He inherits a throne thinned by intrigue, a state where oaths are multi-tools and friendship is rented by the season. When Alexander's weather begins to roll from the west, the court reaches for habits made brittle by overuse. Confidence in titles, hope in numbers, caution that slides into delay. The mainstream fact is unromantic. At Issus and again at Gaugamela, cohesion fails at the moment it's most required. You feel the pause before orders arrive, the hesitation before a flank moves, the tiny gap between we should and we did. Your third light joke arrives almost by reflex, a harried staff officer whispering that what they really need is a calendar invite labeled Defend Empire. All hands, with a reminder 15 minutes prior. Now the betrayal with the sharpest edge walks toward you under an eastern sky. As Darius retreats after Gaugamela, Decius, satrap of Bactria, and Nabarzanes of the cavalry lift the standard of self-preservation. Oaths loosen, the royal chariot becomes a liability. Darius is seized by his own men. When Alexander's riders close the distance, Bessus's faction abandons their living symbol rather than risk the penalty for fidelity. Darius dies on the road sighing, the last independent breath of the Achaemenids vanishing into the dust. Later, Alexander will hunt Bessus down, stage a reckoning, and present justice as theater, a mainstream sequence embroidered by every historian who loves a finale. Debate trails behind the hoofbeats. Was Bessus a villain, or a provincial realist trying to hedge against an unstoppable storm? You stand with the question, feeling how empires die twice, first in the mind, then in the body. From the courtyard you hear laughter. Thin, brittle, courtly. A band tries a cheerful tune, and for a moment the empire remembers how to be beautiful. Silk whispers, sandals sweep, bracelets chime against cups. You picture a young noble rehearsing a toast he hopes will land him a command, a veteran general smiling as if his loyalties were carved in stone, a queen adjusting a veil that could hide a smile or a warning. The taste tester, of course, presses a spoon to his lips with the resigned expression of someone who really should be paid overtime. Duty and procedure continue, though each now feels like the second act perform after the audience has already guessed the ending. A clutch of scholars materializes in your thoughts: Herodotus's heirs, Xenophon's descendants, modern historians with careful footnotes. They argue across time about proportion and blame. Did Greek authors exaggerate Persian decadence to flatter Macedon? Did court insiders like Ctesias inflate anecdotes into opera? How much of betrayal is simply political agility misread by enemies? Some propose structural explanations. The satrapal system incentivized local survival over imperial cohesion. Others emphasize contingency. 2 or 3 different choices at moments like Cunaxa or Gaugamela might have preserved the line. You nod at their caution and keep walking, appreciating how the debates themselves are a kind of tribute. Even in failure, Persia commands analysis. You stop at a gate that looks back over everything you have passed. The murder of a king at night. The gamble of a younger brother with hired Greeks. A choir of satraps who prefer the melody of their own coinage. The queen mother whose dinners require legal counsel. The eunuch who curates succession like an art exhibit. The provincial magnate who swaps oats on the edge of a campfire. Each betrayal reshapes the board. Bishops traded for bribes, knights for rumors, rooks for delays. By sunrise, the position looks the same to a sleepy observer. To you, squinting, the whole center has shifted to squares to the left. The lamp hiss as their oil thins. You exhale, long and slow, and let the record settle. In another mood, these would be cliffhangers and trumpet calls. Tonight they are the soft percussion of an empire's pulse as it slows, or rumor, a memo, a cup, a march, a silence. You smooth your palm along cool stone that keeps its secrets with professional calm. The marble never gossips, but you have heard enough to know how loud the sound once was. If there is a single lesson rising from the tile, it is that the most fatal treason is the ordinary one, when duty is replaced by convenience and everyone nods as if nothing has changed. You continue walking and the hall opens before you like a breath you have been saving all night. Somewhere ahead, dawn will pretend to be innocent. For now, you move softly, knowing that the next footsteps will belong to courtiers still negotiating the latest definition of loyalty. You turn into a quieter corridor, where the torches burn lower and the air smells faintly of rose oil and papyrus. Here the whispers change pitch, softer but more enduring, the kind of influence that rarely stamps its name on tablets yet lingers in every decision. The official reliefs carved on palace walls show kings, satraps, and soldiers, but what they omit is just as telling. The silent corridors where eunuchs drift like shadows, and the royal apartments where women shape policy with a lifted eyebrow, a veiled word, or a carefully placed bracelet. Eunuchs first, in the Achaemenid core, they held trusted positions precisely because they had no direct heirs, no dynastic claim. They guarded the king's chambers, managed the harem, conveyed secret orders, and sometimes whispered into ears that mattered more than swords. Some historians see them as stabilizers, servants of continuity, who maintained ritual and safety. Others argue they became kingmakers, turning neutrality into leverage, their lack of family replaced by loyalty to ambition itself. Bagos is the most infamous, a eunuch whose influence spanned multiple reigns. His fingerprints appear in the succession of Artaxerxes III, the removal of Arses, and even the early career of Darius III. Some say he poisoned two kings, others suggest he merely managed the mechanics of already decided conspiracies. Either way, he represents how a figure with no bloodline could bleed the throne of certainty. A quirky anecdote drifts down these halls. Eunuchs were said to carry not only keys to chambers, but also keys to gossip. One story tells of a eunuch who, asked which noble was most loyal, replied slyly, "The one you are speaking to at this moment," ambiguous, evasive, yet oddly true. You imagine the king sighing, realizing his supposedly neutral servant had just summarized the nature of Persian loyalty in a single sentence: conditional, shifting, impossible to pin down. Then, there are the women. The harem, often caricatured by Greek chroniclers as a den of luxury and decadence, was in reality a political hub. Queens, queen mothers, and favored consorts exercised quiet but formidable influence. Teresatis, mother of Artaxerxes II, looms especially large. Fiercely protective of her son Cyrus, she maneuvered ruthlessly even after his failed revolt. The tale of her poisoned bird dinner, whether true or embroidered, illustrates her reputation: strategic, patient, and lethal when crossed. Scholars debate her legacy. Was she a cunning manipulator undermining stability, or a pragmatic operator keeping her family alive in a vicious court? Either way, her shadow stretches across decades. Royal wives, too, could tip balances. Statera, wife of Artaxerxes II, was said to be beloved by the people and hated by Persiatis, a triangle that only heightened in the palace drama. Consorts and daughters married into satrapal families or foreign dynasties, becoming living treaties. Their loyalties were courted, their influence channeled through whispered words at night. A raised hand, a delayed letter, even a smile withheld at a banquet, each small act could sway decisions. You tread carefully here, for these gestures leave no carved reliefs, but the consequences echo loudly. The scholarly debates swirl. How much power did women and eunuchs truly hold? Some argue Greek sources exaggerated, painting Persian kings as dominated by weaker influences to mock them. Others counter that dismissing these figures is to ignore the subtle, but very real ways courts function. Influence is not only in decrees and darmies. It is in who delivers the message, who interprets the dream, Who decides which official gets audience first? Eunuchs and women sat at those intersections, invisible in monuments, but indispensable in politics. A joke hurls through the gloom. Imagine a satrap boasting of his 1,000 cavalry, only to realize that the Queen Mother's raised eyebrow at dinner has just shifted the king's favor to his rival. No spear needed, no horse saddled, a single glance outmaneuvers an entire regiment. You chuckle softly, though you sense the courtiers did not. You pause by a latticed window, hearing faint laughter from the women's quarters and the soft tread of eunuchs moving silently between chambers. These figures, dismissed in stone, ruled in silence. And as you linger in their shadow, you realize that history's loudest voices often belong to the quietest mouths. The further you wander down the echoing passageways, the more you see not individual plots, but the chain reaction they spark, like a row of lamps that gutter one by one when the oil runs thin. In the Persian Empire's later years, conspiracies rarely ended with a single act. Each coup attempt, each betrayal, left ripples that struck walls far beyond the palace. If one satrap rebelled, another would hesitate to pay tribute. If one king fell to poison, his successor inherited not just the throne but a court marinated in paranoia. You feel this domino effect in the very air, as though every whisper carries the residue of 10 others before it. Take the satraps' revolt of the 360s BCE. A handful of governors in Anatolia rose in defiance of Artaxerxes II, encouraged by outside powers like Sparta and Egypt. Though the great king's authority eventually prevailed in piecemeal fashion, the cost was immense. Troops were drained, coin was scattered, and above all, the illusion of invincibility cracked. Each satrap who bent the knee after rebellion did so a little less loyally and before his eye wandering toward independence. Scholars argue whether this revolt truly weakened the empire or whether it demonstrated resilience that even with multiple provinces in turmoil, the crown still reasserted control. Yet the lingering truth is that after such unrest, obedience was never quite the same. The cracks in loyalty had multiplied. At court, the pattern repeats. Each assassination leaves not closure, a precedent. Artabanus kills Xerxes I, only to be killed himself by Artaxerxes I. Bagos poisons one king, manipulates another, and dies by the same method he mastered. Each act teaches the next conspirator that betrayal is viable currency. A satrap watching from the provinces notes the lesson. If treachery succeeds in Persepolis, why not in Sardis or Susa? You can almost picture nobles swirling his wine, muttering, if kings can be replaced by whispers, so can governors. A curious fringe tale whispers from this era. After one failed conspiracy, a satrap tried to atone by sending the king an elephant decorated in gold cloth, a symbol of renewed loyalty. The king accepted the gift, but still had the satrap quietly executed weeks later. Was it the elephant's fault? Perhaps it trampled the wrong carpet. The story may be embellished, but the message is plain. Once suspicion takes root, loyalty is never trusted again. The empire becomes like a household where every creak of a floorboard suggests a thief in the night. The domino effects stretch outward. Egypt slips free of Persian control, emboldened by the empire's distraction. Greek mercenaries, once hired muscle, become arbiters of power, their swords for sale to whichever Persian faction pays most. Even Persia's famed postal system, the royal road with messengers who could carry news faster than the setting sun, becomes a vehicle for treachery. A sealed tablet arriving at dusk might contain royal orders, or it might carry forged commands from a rival faction. The reliability of communication, once a pillar of Persian rule, erodes under the acid of distrust. Scholars debate the turning point. Was it Hunaxa, where Cyrus's revolt proved that Greeks could stand toe-to-toe with Persian armies? Was it the satraps' revolt, where local governors learned that loyalty was optional? Or was it the endless cycle of court intrigues that hollowed authority from within? Some argue that Persia's administrative system was still sound, noting that taxes continued to flow and festivals continued to dazzle. Others argue the system survived only on inertia, a grand edifice where the facade remained intact even as the beams rotted. The truth, you sense, lies in the middle. The empire functioned, but more brittle each year, like a jar whose glaze still gleamed though the clay beneath had begun to crack. You pause by a column carved with lions gripping bulls, eternal symbols of strength. Yet tonight, the lions look tired, the bulls resistant. You imagine each conspiracy as one more shove, each betrayal another strain, until the sculpture itself begins to creak. The empire, once solid, now trembles not from outside attack but from the slow chain of dominoes tipping within. And as you step into the next corridor, you realize this: betrayal is never singular in effect. It always invites more betrayal, each act feeding the next. And by the time the echoes die, the central hold has loosened beyond repair. You step from the shadowed halls out onto a terrace where the desert air is cooler, fresher, yet heavy with the scent of distant change. Beyond the horizon, you can almost hear the tramp of boots, not Persian, but Macedonian, a rhythm younger, faster, hungry. The empire you walk through is immense, but somewhere to the west, a young king is studying those very cracks you've traced, and sharpening his blade for the moment they gape wide enough to stride through. His name, whispered with a mixture of awe and foreboding, is Alexander. By the mid-4th century BC, Macedonia was not yet the world power it would become. But under Philip II, its armies had been hardened, reformed, and taught to march in tight phalanxes bristling with spears longer than Persian cavalry could easily outmaneuver. When Philip was assassinated, his son Alexander inherited both the throne and the restless ambition to extend it. He was 20 years old, brilliant, audacious, and depending on which chronicler you favor, either divinely guided or dangerously reckless. Scholars debate endlessly, was Alexander's success due to his military genius, or was Persia so fractured that nearly any competent invader could have succeeded? Your steps along the terrace remind you that perhaps both are true, the dagger sharp and the target already bruised. Persia's enemies had been watching for decades. Greek city-states still smarted from earlier wars, Egyptian rebels remembered their moments of independence, and restless satraps in Anatolia had already tasted rebellion. For them, Macedonia's rise was a spark thrown on dry reeds. The mainstream fact is that Alexander launched his campaign in 334 BC, crossing the Hellespont with an army far smaller than Persia's resources could muster. Yet numbers alone did not tell the story. Persia's kings could summon hundreds of thousands, but what good are armies when generals squabble, loyalties flicker, and the king himself is increasingly isolated? A quirky anecdote survives from Alexander's early invasion. Upon landing in Asia Minor, he supposedly thrust a spear into the soil and declared it spear won land. His companions likely applauded. The locals probably raised an eyebrow, muttering that Macedonia's gift was not especially welcome. But the gesture mattered. It symbolized not just conquest but destiny, and destiny is a powerful motivator, especially against an empire mired in hesitation. Meanwhile in Persia, satraps squabbled over who should confront the invader. Some delayed, waiting for clearer instructions from the court. Others half-heartedly raised troops, their eyes already turned toward bargaining with whichever side would ultimately prevail. Scholars disagree on whether Darius III's initial caution was prudent strategy, conserving forces against a reckless upstart, or fatal timidity at ceded momentum. The debate continues, but from where you stand on this terrace, the effect is visible. Alexander moves quickly, striking before Persia can unite, his every step widening the cracks already spreading through the empire. The Persian postal road, once the envy of the world, now carries conflicting reports. Alexander defeated at the river Granicus. One scribe writes, only to be corrected the next day. No, actually it was Persian satraps who fell, their cavalry routed. Confusion breeds more confusion, and uncertainty is the most dangerous contagion in an empire. You can almost imagine couriers galloping past each other in opposite directions, each carrying tablets that cancel the other. From the terrace, you look back at Persepolis. Its columns gleam faintly in the moonlight, serene, magnificent, eternal seeming. Yet you know what Alexander sees, a symbol of excess, an empire so vast it must surely be hollow within. The scholarly debates here are sharp. Was Alexander's conquest inevitable, driven by Macedonian innovation and leadership? Or was it opportunistic, made possible only because Persia had already hollowed itself with decades of intrigue and betrayal? Some argue Alexander would have triumphed regardless, his charisma and tactics unmatched. Others insist a stronger, more united Persia could have resisted, turning him back across the Aegean. As you lean on the terrace railing, the night wind brushing your face, you realize the debate itself mirrors the empire's dilemma. Was its fate in its own hands, or always waiting for an external hand to poach? Whatever the answer, the push has begun. The young king marches, and Persia's twilight deepens with every mile. The palace corridors grow quieter now, as though the very stones of Persepolis are holding their breath. You drift past carved reliefs of warriors and processions, eternal parades etched in stone, but their stillness feels like mockery. For while the walls boast of unity, the court within is splintered, pulled apart by suspicion, by fear, and by the very rivalries that once seemed like mere background whispers. Now, with Alexander pressing forward, those whispers shape the fate of an empire. The Persian court in the age of Darius III was not a place of harmony, but of fraying loyalties. The great king himself was not without talent. Sources suggest he was determined, even brave in battle, but he inherited a throne wobbling beneath the weight of past intrigues. His predecessors had left him an empire vast in territory, yet thin in cohesion. Satraps controlled regions with near-royal autonomy, and while their loyalty had long been bought with privilege, that same privilege now made them hesitant to act in unison. Why risk everything against a Macedonian adventurer? And one might instead bargain for survival if Persia fell. Historians describe the Persian forces at Issus and Gaugamel as immense, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. That size does not equal unity. Consider the satrap Bessus of Bactria, outwardly loyal, inwardly calculating. When Darius faltered, Bessus would betray him, seizing royal authority for himself under the name Artaxerxes V. A betrayal alone speaks volumes. Even as Macedonian spears glittered at the empire's borders, Persian leaders measured their chances not in victory against Alexander, but in positioning themselves for the aftermath of the king's fall. Anecdotes from ancient sources capture this dissonance. One claims that Persian generals argued openly in front of Darius, each insisting their strategy was superior, wasting precious time, while Alexander advanced unopposed. Another tells of messages from rebellious satraps that never reached the king, intercepted by rivals more concerned with courtly advantage and the empire's survival. Whether these tales are strictly accurate or tinged by Greek propaganda, they capture a truth. Persia's greatest enemy was not only outside its walls, but within them. Scholars debate endlessly whether the Persian Empire could have survived Alexander had its court been united. Some argue yes, Persia's wealth and manpower dwarfed Macedonia's, and a concentrated defense could have ground down Alexander's smaller force. Others counter that the rot of court intrigue had already made such unity impossible. Even if Darius had rallied his satraps, the habit of betrayal was too deeply embedded, the machinery of empire too slow to respond to a fast-moving invader. The truth may lie between. Persia had the material to endure but lacked the spirit of cohesion. The irony is bitter. Once, Persian kings thrived on divide and rule, balancing satraps against one another to keep any single noble from growing too powerful. But that same system, so effective in times of stability, became poison when crisis demanded cooperation. What had been a clever balancing act now ensured paralysis. You walk through a side hall where courtiers once clustered, scheming over wine cups, and you can almost hear their debates. Better to hold back, better to see how the wine blows, yet wines do not wait, and armies do not pause. Meanwhile, in the west, Alexander did not hesitate. He struck quickly, decisively, with a cohesion Persia could no longer match. His officers, though ambitious, were bound by fierce loyalty to their king. Persian nobles, by contrast, thought not of empire but of survival, sometimes even of opportunity. The scholar Pierre Bryant calls this moment the dialectic of decline, a grand empire unable to mobilize its scale because its very structure had become brittle. As you pass through the last of the quiet halls, you feel the weight of inevitability. Internal collapse did not merely weaken Persia, it handed Alexander the tools he needed. Every betrayal, every delay, every whispered plot against Darius was another stone pried loose from the empire's foundation. And when external pressure arrived, pressing relentlessly from the west, the cracks did not hold. The night deepens outside, the air heavy with silence. You pause by a tall window. In the distance, you imagine campfires glowing where Persian armies should have stood united. Instead, they are scattered, waiting, uncertain. Behind you, the court remains tangled in its own shadows. Ahead of you, Alexander marches still, the pressure mounting, the empire's defenses crumbling from both within and without. The hush of the palace fades into memory as you drift outward, to the open plains where destiny was decided. Imagine now the dust and heat of Gaugamela in 331 BC. The horizon ripples with the shimmer of countless soldiers, Persian cavalry, chariots gleaming with scythe blades, ranks of archers and infantry stretching so far they seem endless. To many, it must have looked like invincibility itself. The great king, Darius III, had assembled what chroniclers claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen. And yet, in that moment, sheer numbers were an illusion of strength. Beneath the surface, those soldiers represented fractured loyalties and satraps unwilling to fully commit. While Persian nobles rode proudly under banners of silk and gold, their minds were split between obedience and self-preservation. Some held back their best troops, fearing that if Darius lost, they might need those men to bargain with Alexander. Others hesitated, uncertain whether the king's cause was worth dying for. Opposite them, Alexander's army stood small by comparison but unified in will. Each soldier trusted his king, each general followed orders without hesitation. It was the contrast of cohesion against fragmentation, conviction against doubt. The battle unfolded as a slow unraveling. Darius positioned himself in the center, high on his chariot, a vision of royal authority. Yet once the Macedonian phalanx pressed forward and Alexander's cavalry drove into the Persian left flank, the cracks widened. Persian lines buckled, confusion spread. Satraps commanding distant wings debated whether to reinforce or withdraw. Communication faltered. Where unity should have been, there was hesitation. Where clarity was needed, there was only noise. The decisive moment came not through overwhelming force, but through fear. As Alexander's charge punched deep into the heart of the Persian formation, Darius faltered. Accounts differ. Some say his horses panicked, others that he himself lost nerve. What matters is that the king fled the field. In that instant, the image of Persia shattered. A king abandoning his men was more than a tactical misstep, it was a death sentence for loyalty. Soldiers who had sworn to defend their monarch now saw only a retreating chariot. The cohesion of an empire dissolved in the dust. From Nissus to Gaugamela, the pattern repeated. Persian armies were vast, but they were never one. A general withdrew here, a noble defected there, until the cumulative weight of disunity crushed the empire more surely than Macedonian swords. Alexander's victory was not only over soldiers, but over the very system of Persian governance, of alliances that had long sustained the empire but failed catastrophically under strain. After Gaugamela, the road to Persepolis lay open. Alexander entered the jewel of Persia not as a weary invader, but as a conqueror received almost without resistance. The empire that had once stretched from the Indus to the Aegean collapsed not with one battle, but with a sequence of betrayals, hesitations, and fractured loyalties that robbed it of the strength to resist. As you walk now through the imagined ruins, torches flickering on walls that once glittered with gold, the weight of the final blow is palpable. The court intrigues, the betrayals whispered in shadowed halls, the rivalries left unresolved all culminated here, on a plain where the king fled and his empire followed him into oblivion. The silence that lingers afterward is almost unbearable. The great halls of Persepolis will burn, whether by Alexander's order or by the drunken impulse of his men. The symbols of power, the carvings and reliefs that once boasted of Persian supremacy, will be reduced to ash. And yet, the true fire that destroyed the empire began long before, sparked in its own palace, fanned by ambition, and finally consumed by disunity. You close your eyes, in the darkness behind your lids, you hear the echo of hooves, the crash of chariots, the cry of men torn between duty and fear. And then stillness. The final blow has landed. The empire of kings, once so vast and radiant, has crumbled into memory. The dust of Gaugamela settles, the palace flames at Persepolis flicker, then fade into embers. And yet, long after the battlefields have emptied and the voices of courtiers have fallen silent, the Persian Empire does not vanish completely. Empires fall, but legacies endure. As you rest now in this quiet stretch of history, imagine the whispers of later centuries. Historians and chroniclers gaze backward, seeking to understand how a dominion so vast could dissolve with such swiftness. Some say it was fate, that empires are destined to rise and fall like the tides. Others insist it was weakness of leadership, that Darius III lacked the fire of Cyrus or the strategic brilliance of Xerxes in his prime. Still others place blame upon the very structure of the Persian system, an empire too vast to hold, too dependent on loyalty that could never be absolute. But beneath the ruins, fragments of Andron shimmer. The roads built by Darius the Great still tied regions together long after Persian banners fell. The couriers of the royal road, swift as the falcon, became the model for communication in empires yet unborn. Administrative practices, the satrapies, the balancing of local autonomy with central power would echo in governments from Rome to Byzantium. Even in laws, Persia taught the world how to govern on a grand scale. The legacy lived also in memory, though memory is never pure. To the Greeks, Persia was both fearsome and decadent, a cautionary tale of pride and dawn. To Alexander's followers, it was a prize to be absorbed, a jewel to crown their conquests. To later Persians, inheritors of the land if not the throne, it was a source of pride, a reminder that they had once ruled from the Indus to the Nile. And then there were the subtler legacies, those carried not by armies but by ideas. Zoroastrian faith, with its struggle between light and darkness, shaped religions across the world, seeding concepts of heaven, hell, angels, and judgment. The Persian ideal of kingship, majestic, divine or yet burdened with responsibility, echo in courts from India to Europe. Even Alexander, who sought to present himself as heir rather than destroyer, adopted Persian dress, rituals, and the title of great king. It is in this paradox that Persia's ruin finds its meaning. Though its palaces burned and its kings were dethroned, its influence seeped quietly into the fabric of civilizations that followed. An empire can collapse in the span of a single generation, yet its cultural breath can linger for millennia. Imagine now the ruins of Persepolis under moonlight. Broken columns reach upward like fingers still clutching at the sky. The carvings of procession soldiers, nobles, emissaries stand weathered yet visible, a silent testimony to the vision of empire. The flames that Alexander kindled could not erase these stones. They could not erase the memory, the people, who once ruled a world. And so, as you drift further into rest, consider this: Persia's fall was not an end, but a transformation. Its grandeur became a story, its ashes became a lesson, its fragments became foundations for others. Empires may perish, but the ideas they leave behind weave themselves into history's endless tapestry. You breathe deeply, the silence of centuries envelops you. Persia has fallen, yet Persia remains etched into stone, written into faith, whispered in the halls of power where new rulers learned from the fate of the old. The legacy of ruin is not merely loss, but endurance. And in that endurance, the empire of Persia still lives. The empire is gone, yet its shadow remains. Close your eyes and wander through the silence of Persepolis. Imagine the columns rising, fractured yet proud. Though the fires have long since burned out, the air still hums with what once was. The echoes of courtly intrigue, the clash of ambitions, the whispers of conspiracies all linger in the stones, waiting for someone to remember. History, after all, is not a straight road but a weaving thread. The Greeks who conquered Persia could not help but borrow from its grandeur. Alexander's generals draped themselves in Persian robes, ate from Persian tables, and ruled from Persian palaces. To rule Persia, they had to become Persians themselves. In this way, the vanquished shaped the victors. Centuries later, the Romans to study Persia with a wary eye. They admired the highways that stitched distant lands together. They noted the satrapies, the governors, the careful balance between freedom and obedience. Rome, for all its pride, could not help but echo the empire that had come before. Even the word Caesar would later transform into Shah, as rulers in the East claimed the lineage of kingship Persia had defined. And then, there was faith. Zoroaster's vision of light and darkness seeped quietly into hearts far beyond Persia's borders. The struggle of good against evil, the judgment of souls, the fire a symbol of purity, all of these ideas traveled along the same roads where Persian couriers once rode. By the time the empire was gone, its beliefs had already taken root in lands it had never conquered. In later centuries, poets and chroniclers would return to the ruins, gazing at the carved stairways where once emissaries from all nations had ascended. They asked, how could so vast a dominion crumble? Some said betrayal within the court, others blamed the arrogance of kings who forgot the fragility of power. But all agreed, Persia had reached for greatness, and in doing so, had carved itself into the memory of mankind. Now, as you lie still in the quiet of night, let those whispers guide you. They speak not only of power lost but of power remembered. The ruins are not silent, they murmur lessons. They warn of ambition unguarded, of alliances betrayed, of loyalty bought too cheaply. Yet they also inspire, reminding us that even in downfall, beauty can survive. Persia's memory became a mirror for all empires that came after. To rise to hide, to forget humility, to drown in one's own splendor, this was the path to ruin. And yet, to build roads, to dream of unity, to govern with vision, these were gifts Persia left to the world. In the stillness, you can almost hear the procession of shadows. The kings and courtiers, the traders and generals, all moving in silence across the moonlit ruins. They are not gone, they linger in the mind, in the lessons, in the whispers. And so the empire of Persia endures not in banners or armies, but in the story it has become. You close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them, the Persian plain has shifted into something quieter. The empire is gone now, Alexander's banners have long since been rolled up, but the land is still there, rolling deserts, mountain ridges like frozen waves, and an emptiness so large that it feels like it could swallow time itself. And you realize something a little unnerving. Silence has a memory. The desert is patient, and while empires shout, deserts whisper, holding on to secrets like a vault no thief can break. The mainstream historians will tell you that ruins such as Persepolis are the chief witnesses of Persia's greatness. Stones, carvings, reliefs of kings receiving tribute they endure, sun-bleached and stubborn. Yet, the desert itself is an equal archivist. Its silence is not blank. It carries echoes of camel caravans, clattering hooves of satrapal messengers, the shuffle of soldiers trudging in sandals at disintegrated centuries ago. Every gust of hot wind across the plateau feels like an old chronicler, brushing the story across your skin. Here's a quirky detail. Ancient travelers sometimes swore that the desert could sing, not in the poetic sense, but literally. Certain dunes in Central Asia produce a low humming resonance when the sand slides, like a giant hidden gong. Imagine being a half-lost caravan trader, hearing the landscape itself groan like an angry cello. You'd probably decide the gods were mumbling at you, either encouragement or, more likely, turn back. Genius. It's one of those fringe tidbits that shows nature is sometimes the better storyteller than man. Scholars actually debate whether this singing sand phenomenon influenced how ancient Persians mythologized their landscape. Some argue it explained desert spirits, while others dismiss it as coincidence. A few even connect it to ritual songs that mimic the eerie resonance, suggesting that what you hear in the desert shaped what you sang in the temple. Nothing like a dune acting as your backing vocalist. And in that eerie music, you sense the continuity. The Persian kings thought themselves immortal through stone inscriptions and monumental architecture. Yet what endures just as strongly is emptiness. The quiet stretches where no one stands, where only the wind rehearses history. You picture a caravan pausing at an abandoned outpost, its wool dry, its walls crumbled, but still the traders mark it on their journey. They mutter, "Ah yes, here once ruled the great king." They pour water in respect, maybe spill a little wine, then keep walking. The silence records the act, file stamped by the desert's patience. Of course, the serious academic in the back row will interject, silence cannot record, only people can. But tell that to anyone who has sat in a ruin at dusk. The stillness speaks louder than all the textbooks stacked in your local library. It reminds you, insistently, that noise is temporary. That all cries, imperial decrees, applause in the throne hall, all of it eventually decays into hush. Here's the sardonic punchline. Humans build empires like teenagers starting garage bands. They think they'll last forever, that everyone will remember their killer riffs, but history is the desert. It's that one skeptical neighbor, arms crossed, saying, "Sure, we'll see how long you last." The neighbor is always right. And yet, in that quiet, you feel something oddly comforting. The desert doesn't gloat, it doesn't tell you "I told you so," it just waits. For the next empire, the next set of footprints, the next ambitious fool to believe the silence can be bent to their will. Spoiler: it never can. You tilt your head and realize you're hearing not just echoes of Persia, but the anticipation of Rome, Byzantium, Islam, Mongol, Ottoman. The desert swallowed them all in turn, yet also kept them preserved in memory. That's the paradox. Silence erases, but silence also preserves. You can't fight it, you can only listen, and as you let that thought settle, your breathing slows. The chaos of conspiracies, assassinations, betrayals, it has all quieted. What remains is the steady, patient hum of the land. A reminder that the empire's end was not just Alexander's or courtly betrayals. It was also inevitability. Time itself wears down nose, and only silence survives to tell the tale. So, as you rest here on this plane, think of it not as an ending but as a transfer. Tower vanishes, but stories remain, folded into dunes, painted into sunsets, hummed in the singing sand. The desert is patient, it waits for you to listen. And right now, you finally are. If the kings were the fire blazing at the center of the empire, then the satraps were the sparks flung outward, scattered across Persia's immense provinces. They were governors, tax collectors, defenders, diplomats, sometimes tyrants, sometimes visionaries, but in truth, they were human, ambitious, calculating, and perpetually aware that the king's favor could turn into the king's axe in the time it takes a messenger to arrive. Imagine it. In Sardis, Dactra, or Susa, there once stood provincial palaces not quite Persepolis in grandeur, but elaborate enough to remind visitors that power radiated outward. Those palaces are gone now, erased by fire, war, or centuries of disrepair. Yet if you stand on some lonely hill in Anatolia or look across the Oxus River, you can almost sense them. Their outlines still cling to the soul like phantom architecture. And here's a strange thing. Archaeologists digging at sites once governed by satraps often find traces of everyday luxury wine, amphorae, imported from Greece. Persian rugs dyed with deep crimson, fragments of banquets that were both political theater and insurance policy. Because every satrap knew that loyalty wasn't written in stone, it was negotiated over dinner. A bribe disguised as a feast, a promise whispered over a cup of wine, a nod that said we're allies until the next tax season. But the desert and the ruins tell another side. Forgotten satraps left inscriptions no one reads, minted coins that no one spends, built tombs no one visits. The echo of their power is faint compared to Darius or Xerxes. And yet, paradoxically, the satraps mattered more in daily life. The farmer in Anatolia rarely saw the king of kings. He saw the satrap's tax collector. The merchant in Bactria didn't know royal decrees firsthand. He knew whether the satrap's garrison allowed him to pass the checkpoint without extortion. To most subjects, the empire was the satrap. It's here where shadows grow thick. The satraps were always half in light, half in darkness. Too powerful for the king to fully trust, too necessary to eliminate. History tells us they often rebelled, sometimes successfully, sometimes spectacularly crushed. And even when they lost, the land remembered their defiance. In Anatolia, legends linger of governors who declared themselves kings for a few years, issuing coinage, holding court, pretending that the silence of the empire would accept their performance. Eventually, the great king sent armies, and silence turned red with fire. But after centuries, who recalls the difference between loyal satrap and rebellious upstart? Only ruins, whispering. One satrap might be remembered for lavish patronage of temples. Another for cruelty so vile that villagers prayed for liberation by foreign invaders. Yet when archaeologists sift their palaces, the evidence levels them all. Charred beams, broken pottery, worn mosaics. Grandeur collapses into rubble at about the same speed. Whether you were generous or monstrous, that's the dark democracy of decay. And then there's the personal side. Picture a satrap reclining at night, staring into the shadows cast by oil lamps on the painted walls of his hall. He knows the court at Persepolis is far away. He knows the king's era is filled with rumors. He knows his rivals in neighboring provinces would gladly supply those rumors. He whispers to his wife, or his scribe, or maybe no one at all, "Will I be remembered? Or will silence bury me before the king does?" That's the eternal dread of provincial power, glory in the moment, obscurity forever. The shadows in these forgotten palaces stretch across centuries. Stand in one today, maybe just a mount, maybe a cracked foundation, and you'll feel them. You'll hear faint banquets, faint rebellions, faint dreams of independence. The desert, again, has been patient. It did not keep the satraps' names on everyone's lips. But it kept their outlines, their echoes, and for a moment, as you listen, you might even believe that forgotten satraps breathe again, rising from silence, not as kings, not as rebels, but as shadows, proof that power, when provincial, is always fragile, always temporary, always echoing. And then the wind shifts, and the shadow fades, and you realize you are the only one left listening. The satrap's dream dissolves into sand, carried away with the rest of the empire. Empires are often remembered by their kings, their armies, their monuments. But the truth, empires breathe through their merchants. They are the capillaries of power, carrying wealth, rumor, culture, and betrayal along the veins of trade. Persia was no different. The royal road, stretching from Sardis to Susa, wasn't just a highway of caravans. It was a living artery. Every hoofbeat, every creaking wheel, carried both spices and secrets. Imagine the caravans at dusk, camels burdened with bales of silk, jars of wine, sacks of grain, all wrapped in dust. Alongside them, merchants rode with cautious eyes. They spoke Persian, Aramaic, Greek, Median, Bactrian. Their tongues switched as easily as coins from hand to hand. And in every whispered bargain, there was more than trade. There was information. Which satrap grew restless, which courtier had fallen from favor, which city had quietly stockpiled grain for war. Merchants lived in ambiguity. They owed taxes to the satraps, yet relied on the goodwill of local villagers. They sought profit in Persian ports, yet drank wine with Greek traders who might one day sail as enemies. And because they were everywhere, they became invisible. A satrap could send spies, but merchants were spies by default, their ears attuned to the tremor of unrest. Consider Babylon, once a jewel of the empire, always simmering with rebellion. Its bazaars buzzed with sellers of textiles, incense, livestock. But in the hushed corners of taverns, deals went deeper. Persian officials tried to look away, Babylonian nobles muttering promises of revolt, Greek envoys feigning interest in barley, but truly asking about troop numbers. A single caravan could carry more danger than an army if it bore rumors instead of weapons. And in this web, loyalty was always negotiable. Merchants who once praised the great king could, by the next season, fund a rebellion. Why? Because profit had no homeland. If war brought higher prices, then war became business. To them, betrayal wasn't treachery, it was commerce. This is the irony. While satraps schemed in palaces and kings plotted in Persepolis, it was the merchants who set the rhythm of empire. A famine in Egypt echoed in Anatolian markets. A skirmish in Bactria shifted silver prices in Sardis. The empire looked solid on its monuments, but beneath, it was fragile, because its veins were filled not with loyalty but with trade. There are whispers that some rebellions began not in palaces, but in marketplaces. A caravan delayed, a shipment seized, a rumor inflated, traded, amplified until fear became action. Merchants didn't raise banners, but they set the stage for those who did, and often, they profited either way. War meant supply contracts, peace meant stability. As long as coin flowed, the empire's fate was just background music. Picture, if you will, a merchant reclining in a tent after a long day's journey. Outside, the desert wind howls. Inside, he counts his silver, but his true wealth is intangible. Knowledge. He knows which satrap is vulnerable, which garrison is underpaid, which ally is secretly preparing to betray. He smiles faintly, because he can sell that knowledge to any one Persian, Greek, or rebel. The great king believes armies protect his empire. The merchant knows it's really information. But here's the cruelest twist. History rarely records merchants. Their names vanish faster than the ink on papyrus. Satraps, at least, carved inscriptions, kings built monuments, merchants. They left ledgers that crumbled, contracts that rotted, gossip that dissolved into air. All that remains is the faint awareness that commerce was never just commerce, it was conspiracy in motion. Stand today among the ruins of old caravanserais in Iran or Anatolia. Cracked walls where once merchants slept, hearths where meals were shared, courtyards where camels groaned under their loads. The stones are silent, but if you close your eyes, you can hear faint whispers in the night air. Prices negotiated, bribes exchanged, rumors spun. The very same whispers that shaped empires more than swords ever did. The merchants knew, they always knew, and they whispered their knowledge in marketplaces, over wine, in back rooms, in languages that blurred borders. Their whispers became conspiracies, and their conspiracies became history. And yet, like the satraps, the desert has swallowed their names. All we have left are echoes. Faint, but enough to remind us that the empire's heart didn't beat in Persepolis alone. It beat in the caravan trails, in the silver coins rubbed thin by countless hands, in the whispers that refused to die. When people hear the word harem, they often imagine soft cushions, music, and perfumes. But in Persia, the harem was not only a chamber of pleasure, it was a court of politics, veiled and deadly. Behind carved cedar doors and thick curtains, power shifted in whispers, not proclamations. The king ruled the empire, but the queen ruled the king's nights. She could soothe his anger, plant suspicions in his heart, or turn his eyes toward a rival to be destroyed. Her words, spoken softly before dawn, could weigh heavier than a satrap's army. But the queen was not alone. Around her circled other women, concubines, princesses from foreign lands, attendants born of noble families. Each carried ambition like a hidden dagger, each watched for signs of favor or neglect. The queen, though crowned, was not always secure. She had to guard her place like a soldier guards a fortress constantly, warily. History remembers Amastris, wife of Xerxes. Chroniclers accused her of cruelty, of jealous wrath. Perhaps those stories were colored by Greek enemies, but perhaps they carried a kernel of truth. For within the harem, rivalries could turn lethal. A glance from the king could make a woman powerful or mark her for ruin. And the queen had to ensure that her position remained unshaken, even if it meant destroying others in silence. Picture the evening feast, dancers swaying, music trembling on strings, golden cups overflowing with wine. Yet beneath the perfume and laughter, daggers hid in every smile. One concubine's laughter could be a challenge, another's silence, a plot. The queen would watch them carefully, her face serene, her thoughts sharpening like steel. The harem was also diplomacy. Foreign princesses married into the royal family brought not only beauty but political leverage. A daughter of Babylon might carry her city's loyalty or betrayal. A Greek maiden might be a gift of peace or a spy in silk. The queen's task was to weave these women into the fabric of the palace, to ensure no foreign thread unraveled the empire. And yet, in this world of curtains and whispers, men often underestimated them. Courtiers spoke of women as adornments, but within the palace walls, they traded influence like coins. A servant could pass messages to eunuchs, eunuchs could bend the ear of generals. Generals could rise or fall based on rumors seeded in the harem. What appeared fragile was, in truth, an unseen network of power. Think of a scene at dawn, the king still half asleep, his queen beside him. She leans close, her voice barely above a whisper. "My lord, beware of the satrap of Lydia, he feasts too often, speaks too boldly. His wealth grows faster than loyalty, alas." The king frowns, nods slowly. Later that day, orders are given, inspections arranged, alliances shifted. All from a single whisper in the shadow of dawn. The tower in the harem cut both ways, queens who pressed to hard-risked suspicion. Concubines who schemed clumsily vanished. The palace was vast, and its walls thick enough to muffle screams. A woman might be banished to a distant estate, or simply disappear, her name erased. To survive meant mastering balance. Too quiet, and you were forgotten. Too bold, and you were destroyed. Yet amid this tension, there were moments of tenderness. The queen was also mother. Princes were raised within these walls, and her protection could determine which child would grow into a king. The line of succession often began not in the council chamber, but in the harem nursery. A queen who secured her son's future secured her own immortality. And so, lullabies sung in the harem were not only songs of love, but also acts of strategy. Imagine a young prince, asleep under embroidered blankets, unaware that his very breath carried the weight of dynasties. His mother's eyes linger on him with love, but also with calculation. Every ally she makes, every rival she thwarts, is for him. If he rises, so does she. If he falls, she falls with him. The stakes could not be higher, and still, despite the politics, the harem was a place of isolation. Women lived within gilded walls, surrounded by riches, yet prisoners of their own rank. They could not walk the markets, see the empire they helped shape, or touch the lives their whispers alter. They were shadows in silk, shaping history unseen. To walk now through the ruins of Persepolis is to see carved reliefs of kings, warriors, courtiers. The women are absent, their faces were never etched in stone. That absence does not mean insignificance. Their hands may not have held swords, but they guided the ones who did. Their voices may not echo in inscriptions, but they echoed in decisions that read her maps. So tonight, as the story lingers in your ears, picture the queen, sitting silent behind a curtain, her eyes sharp, her lids still. The court beyond her may roar with debates, but she waits for the quiet hour when the king leans close, and her whisper becomes law. For in Persia, veils could hide daggers, and silence could command empires. The palace at night was a world apart. To noise of markets, the shouting of soldiers, even the debates of courtiers all fell silent beyond its thick walls. Only the flicker of oil lamps remained, trembling against marble floors. And in that silence, danger moved most freely. Assassins were not always masked men with daggers leaping from shadows. In Persia, the art of assassination was more subtle, more refined. A poisoned cup of wine, a robe scented with toxins, a whisper that led a victim to the wrong chamber at the wrong time, these could be more effective than steel. To kill with a dagger was crude. To kill without leaving a mark was an art. Yet the dagger still had its place. The candlelit halls were long and winding, filled with pillars that cast deep shadows. An enemy could wait unseen behind a curtain, blade drawn, footsteps muffled by thick carpets. One strike, swift and silent, and a rival was erased. The body would vanish by dawn, carried away through secret passages that honeycombed the palace foundations. The Persians understood this theater of shadows. The king's guards were everywhere, their spears glinting, their eyes watchful. But no guard could see everything, and when power was at stake, even a guard's loyalty could be bought. Gold could blind eyes faster than darkness. There are stories, half rumor, half truth, of courtiers who vanished overnight. One evening they feasted, boasting of their favor. By morning their chambers were empty. Their names struck from records. Their allies would whisper, their enemies would smile. And the palace life moved on, as if the man had never existed. In Persia, forgetting was as dangerous as killing. Assassins came not only from within, foreign powers sent their own blades into the empire's heart. A satrap loyal to Babylon might smuggle in mercenaries. A Greek envoy might arrive with hidden knives. Even eunuchs thought to be harmless could be bribed to open a door at the right moment. The palace became a labyrinth where trust itself was rare, and suspicion was a currency more valuable than silver. Imagine a banquet hall. The king reclines on cushions, musicians strum lyres, the courtiers laugh. Yet at the far end of the hall, a servant pours wine into golden cups. His hands are steady, but his eyes are fixed. He knows one drop too much from the wrong vial, and history will change tonight. He breathes slowly, carefully, as though the weight of empire sits in his jug. Sometimes, assassins failed, a dagger caught in midair, a servant exposed before the drop touched the cup. And when they failed, punishment was swift and merciless. They might be flayed alive, their skin nailed to gates as a warning. The Persians did not forgive treachery, they displayed it as spectacle. Yet, even such horrors could not silence ambition. For in the palace, the promise of power was stronger than fear. The candlelight itself seemed to conspire with assassins. Flames trembled, shadows lengthened, corridors twisted. One could almost hear footsteps when none were there, see movement in the corner of the eye. The palace became alive at night, breathing softly, as if guarding its secrets. There is one tale, whispered by chroniclers, of a satrap who grew too bold. He feasted lavishly, spoke with arrogance, and plotted rebellion. One evening, he was summoned to the king's private chamber. The chamber was dark, lit by only 3 candles. As he bowed, a figure stepped from the shadows. Not the king, but a silent blade. The satrap fell without a cry, and the candles flickered once, then steadied. By dawn, no one spoke of him again. His estates were seized, his family erased, his name dissolved into silence. Such was the power of assassination. In Persia it was not merely the taking of life, but the erasure of memory. To die was one thing, to vanish from history was another. And the palace excelled in making enemies disappear without a trace. But not all assassins were faceless, some were princes themselves, impatient heirs who grew tired of waiting for crowns. Some were queens who feared losing favor, who plotted against rivals in silk. Some were satraps whose loyalty bent with the wind, who preferred to gamble with daggers rather than armies. The palace was a chessboard, and every piece king, queen, pawn could become the assassin if the moment demanded it. Picture now long corridor. The lamps burn low, the night deepens. Footsteps echo softly measured, careful. A shadow glides along the wall, hand clutching a blade wrapped in cloth. The air is heavy, thick with silence. A single mistake, one creak of a sandal, one misstep and the assassin becomes the hunted. But for now, only the candlelight watches, and the empire sleeps. Assassins thrived because Persia's empire was vast. With so many provinces, so many ambitions, there were always men willing to risk their lives for gold or vengeance. The palace could never be truly safe, and perhaps that was the truth of power. To rule was to live always in the shadow of the knife. Even kings themselves felt it. Xerxes, who once commanded hundreds of thousands, feared whispers in the night. Darius, mighty and unyielding, listened for footsteps outside his chamber. The crown glittered by day, but at night it became a weight, heavy with fear. And so the palace lived between two truths: loyalty by sunlight, treachery by candlelight. The same hands that poured wine by day could hold daggers by night. The same lips that praised the king in council could curse him in whispers. The empire stretched vast across deserts and mountains, but within the palace walls, it could shrink to the tip of a knife. So let the candle burn low, let the shadows deepen. Somewhere in the silence, a dagger waits. And with a single thrust, history may change before dawn. The candles have burned low, their wax drips slowly, one bead after another, until the flame is no more than a soft breath against the darkness. The corridors that once echoed with footsteps, with laughter, with cries of fear, now rest in silence. The palace sleeps. Assassins have come and gone, kings have risen and fallen. Names that once thundered through the empire have dissolved into dust, carried away by the winds that sweep the desert. The great stone walls remain, but even they are weary, their carving softened by time. What remains is not the dagger, nor the poisoned cup, nor the whispers of conspiracy. What remains is the lesson: power is never safe, never still. To rule is to live under shadow, to walk each night with the knowledge that silence can be more dangerous than an army. And yet, in that silence, there is also peace. The palace, vast and eternal, continues to watch. It has seen countless plots unfold, countless blades strike, countless rulers dream of immortality. But in the end, Every crown is set aside, every banquet ends, every candle gutters out. So let us leave the palace now, let us step away from its corridors of marble and shadow. Let us walk beyond the walls, where the desert stretches wide and endless beneath the stars. Out here, the empire feels small, the power struggles smear whispers against eternity. The Persians believed that kings were chosen by the gods, that their rule carried divine light. But even divine light cannot banish the night forever. The night always returns, bringing with it silence, memory, and forgetting. And so, the story closes not with a scream, more with the clash of steel, but with a breath, the soft exhale of a candle flame, vanishing into the dark. The palace sleeps, the empire breathes, and the shadows wait for another dawn.